I have a proposal for Malaysia's education system, as an educator myself, and that would be the complete and total abolition of all private schooling and making Malaysia's government schools great again. Hello, good afternoon from the cruel, brutal capitalist dictatorship of Kuala Lumpur. Today, I'm standing outside one of the most prestigious international schools, the IGB International School, which boasts an almost 100% expat teacher population. Well, I, sir, as you know, am a British man trapped in the body of a Chinese fellow, so technically I am what you would describe as a native speaker of English, but sadly, I'm the wrong skin color. So sadly, a chocolate man like myself would see the day pigs fly sooner than he gets accepted to teach English at any of the posh and poncy international schools in Kuala Lumpur. Anyway, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, do so. And without further ado, let's begin. You know, this might seem rather hypocritical of me, considering that everyone knows I once taught at a private school, a private international school at that. So to call for the abolition of these institutions which provide me with my bread and butter does seem a little bit hypocritical, does it not? Well, not really, because having worked in the private school system and having studied in the private school system myself, from Form 1 to Form 5, I have come to the conclusion that these institutions are a barrier to progress, because we cannot have elitism in education. As Confucius once said, there ought to be no class distinctions in education. And private schools, as well as international schools, fundamentally promote class divisions. On a local level, we can talk about the private schools promoting class distinctions between Malaysians. And on an international level, we can talk about international schools promoting class distinctions between the precious pearls who happen to be children of the expatriates and the local Malaysian plebs. Well, there are a couple of Tan Sris and Datoks and Datins who do send their children to international schools, but the reality is that these institutions fundamentally foster class divisions. Well, if you were to ask most Malaysian parents on why they send their children to private and international schools, they will tell you that the system of education is much better in these schools. And that's a very difficult point to argue against, because frankly, considering the appalling standards of our Malaysian government school, in no small part thanks to Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, the man who engineered the destruction of our Malaysian education and breathed the kiss of life into vernacular schools, our Malaysian parents who can afford it are opting to send their children to private and international schools. Because at least, even though those schools are elitist and they foster class distinctions, at least the children will get a higher standard of education, they'll learn critical thinking, and they'll learn, enough to sustain themselves in the world outside of Malaysia. Unfortunately, if you go to a government school, I am very sorry to say, but government schools today teach a very parochial and closed-minded worldview. And they basically teach students that nothing outside of Malaysia is important, and the only important language in this country is Malay. When the reality is, and I know full well, even though I don't speak Chinese, that you can't make a living with Malay when you go and trade on an international basis, because there simply aren't enough Malay speakers. But you can make a living with English or Mandarin. So government schools fundamentally have turned into reactionary, ideological indoctrination centers in order to inspire a sense of misplaced pride in being Malaysian. Even though there's currently very little to be proud of to be Malaysian, considering the ultra-reactionary state of this country. We are a nation that is extremely unfortunate, a nation that bends the knee to the Western colonial powers 70 years after independence. No, almost 70 years after independence. We are not truly an independent nation with sovereignty that can charter its own course in the annals of history, because we still depend on the goodwill of the Western imperialist capitalist powers. The people who lead our country are basically the surrogates of the British. The British never left this country. They simply rule us by proxy today, with their colonial surrogates ruling us. I am proud to be Malaysian, don't get me wrong, but not proud to be Malaysian of the Malaysia that Pakatan Harapan has created. I want to be proud to be Malaysian of the Malaysia that we claim to be. That is the sort of pride that I want to have, that is currently being enforced in the national school system. I know I shit on Chinese Altras a lot, and I do think this is going to piss off a lot of people, but I do think that vernacular schools are indeed an outmoded form of education that should have withered away by the end of the 1960s, if not for May 13, which basically drove a wedge between the Chinese and the Malays, but also breathed the kiss of life back into vernacular schools. In addition to Mahathir's disastrous educational policies, I am also, I do think that vernacular schools, because they were created in order to prepare the Chinese diaspora for their return from their exodus back to China, will indeed someday be an outmoded form of education. But the day is not today yet, because say what you want about them, they still provide the best possible alternative to government schools because of their rigorous standards of education and the fact that the Chinese community takes education very seriously. So Chinese business people do pour in a lot of money into vernacular schools in order to provide the best possible education for the children. Now, that's on one hand. On the other hand, what I don't like is the chauvinism and the superiority complex to bananas like myself, but I can understand why people are fighting to defend them, because what else can you offer for a Chinese working class parent, who can't afford to send their children to private or international schools? What can we offer? There are a couple of good government schools, don't get me wrong. Places like the Penang Free School or the Sri Aman Girls School. But besides that, I have to say that most of our government schools have plummeted in standards. Most of them have plummeted, I am sorry to say. But in today's video, I want to say that government schools used to be great, and we can make them great again. But yeah, when the right-wing Malaysian reactionaries talk about abolishing vernacular schools, the reason why, even though they may have a point, in some manner of speaking, they may have a point that they are a barrier to cohesion because they create a very insular comfort zone. This analysis falls on deaf ears in our country. And the Chinese community generally just laughs at this analysis, because what can the right-wing reactionaries in Malaysia offer that's better than vernacular schools for working-class parents who can't afford the exorbitant school fees of international schools? There are only so many places in the Penang Free School or the Sri Aman Girls School or the Bukit Nanas convent. There are only so many places in the very few respectable government schools. But don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that government school teachers are worthless and useless and incompetent. That is not what I'm saying. The poor souls who work at those places are but cogs in a system that they cannot change on an individual basis. The fact of the matter is that the rot started decades ago with Mahathir, and the rot has festered. The rot, as they say, a fish rots from its head. So the rot has festered from the fish's head all the way to its body by now. And the fact of the matter is that, yes, government schools of today, of today's standards, are pitiful. I once posted to a Malaysian forum on Reddit asking on how we could improve the state of Malaysia's government schools, that we could somehow instill confidence in the parents once again. And I got many good responses, but far too many people started blaming the government school teachers. Far too many people were saying that government school teachers were simply lazy and incompetent, and simply put, they had very, very low standards, basically. Now, while I can agree that the ruling administrations which governed government schools, and this comes from personal experience from my students as well, are incompetent and useless many of the time, I think it's very unfair and very, very wrong to blame the teachers for what is a systemic problem. Because, as I've said, many hard-working and principled souls end up joining the government school system with the belief that they can somehow make a change. And yet, despite all that, they are but a cog in the machine, which is basically a system that needs to be changed from the bottom up. Sorry, that needs to be changed from the top down. You can't expect high standards from an organization in which the administration itself is promoted not on the basis of merit, but on race and religion, or nepotism, connections. To be fair, Guanxi exists in just about every institution. Even Chinese schools have Guanxi involved, right? Even incompetent people get promoted in Chinese schools if they know the right people. But it's particularly bad in government schools. It is. And there was once a case of a history teacher, this is from my students' experience, insisting that all the students use the book that she wrote, even though that book was an absolutely atrocious book. She insisted that everybody use it. Do you know why? Because she was very proud to have written it herself. But my student, who is my English student, had to ask me for help with her sejarah or with her history, because her teacher's book was not sufficient. So, until Malaysian government schools can basically clear themselves of the dead weight in these schools, you can't blame the teachers collectively for a problem that is systemic, for a problem that results as a result of the nepotism and crony culture that is practiced in these schools. So the goal should not be to call for the abolition of vernacular schools, which are the least bad option that parents have, as opposed to the government schools, which are much, much worse. I'm aware there are issues that people are concerned about that vernacular schools might pose. For example, the Chinese chauvinism that may result. But overall, I think they've done a good job in uplifting the material conditions of poor and working class Chinese people's children. So I can't fault them for that. But having said that, however, you can't just call for their abolition without offering a better solution. There are no vernacular schools in Singapore. Do you know why? Because Lee Kuan Yew basically starved them of their enrollment by making government schools so awesome, so prestigious, that parents would actually fight to send their children to Singaporean government schools. He didn't abolish them. He actually made them so outstanding, so prestigious, that parents, I can't believe I'm praising Lee Kuan Yew, but that parents actually sent their children to government schools, which gave the students a much more holistic and less parochial outlook in life, while offering mother tongue education. Because another concern that the Chinese and the Indians in Malaysia have is, if I send my children to a government school, will they be indoctrinated? Will they be indoctrinated to lose their Indianness or Chineseness? Will they end up to be a dirty banana like Comrade Confucius? Well, you have to ensure them that no, they're not going to lose their culture. They're not going to lose their mother tongue. And of course, the thing is, government schools have to be secular. You cannot have any religion or any ideology that takes precedence over any other. It has to be fair to everyone. That is one way you will inspire confidence in the Malaysian parents to send their children to government school. Because confidence has to be earned. You cannot demand confidence from the parents. You have to be able to inspire confidence in people. And right now, most government schools are not doing a very good job at inspiring confidence. Now, this might be an extremely difficult thing to believe, those of you who are not old enough to remember, but in the 1950s and 1960s, vernacular schools were already withering away. And I'm very sorry if this offends you, if you feel very, very strongly attached to the Chinese vernacular schools. I'm not actually trying to hurt your feelings by saying this, but these schools were already withering away and getting outmoded by the public schools, which offered a far more holistic and well-rounded education and a less parochial worldview. I'm not trying to offend you, I'm only stating facts as per my observation. Now, the fact of the matter is that my grandmother was an English teacher at a government school in the 50s and 60s. And teachers of that generation were very, very much well respected by their students. You can ask English-speaking boomers today who went under the public school system in the 50s and 60s. They will tell you good things about their teachers. They had very, very good experiences with their teachers. Because in the 50s and 60s, before Dr. Mahathir trashed public education in Malaysia, we were on a very good trajectory. Did you know that in the 50s and 60s, in the 60s, we were far more prosperous than Singapore? Did you know that? Yes, we would be much more prosperous than Singapore today if not for the good old Dr. Mahathir, who trashed our government school system by basically injecting ethnic nationalism into the system, by changing the syllabus into Malay rather than English, which is a far, far more widely used language than Malay. I'm not downplaying the importance of Malay in this country, but the reality is, on an international level, you cannot make a living with Malay, doing business in Malay internationally. But you can make a living doing business in English and Mandarin, right? So this nationalistic move, the declining standards of English in our country, coupled with increased radicalization in the government schools to the point when non-Muslim students are not even allowed to eat. They can, but they have to bring their own food, has caused many parents to feel alienated. So if they can afford it, they send their children to private schools. If they can't afford it, they send their children to vernacular schools. But the point is that the beginning of the end of Malaysia's education started in the 70s. Government schools used to be very well respected until then. But again, I must stress, do not blame the teachers for a problem that is a systemic one. Blame the people in power. And last but not least, I would like to talk about international schools, which is to me something that really does not need to exist. Because international schools are fundamentally places where expats from wealthier countries often send their children, so that their children will not basically be a part of the Malaysian education system. They will not be part of the Malaysian society, the mainstream Malaysian society. And this also is a form of class distinction between expats and locals. Why the hell should the children of expats, whether they be diplomats or whether they be business people who come to Malaysia, why should they receive a special form of schooling? Everyone who comes to this country should go under the same schooling system, in my opinion. And that is why I also believe that under socialism in future, international schools ought to be abolished. Government schools should be so great, so impressive, and so high quality that parents not only want to send their children, but will fight to send their children to them. But I also believe that international schools have no place in a classless Malaysia. Because in the multipolar world, in a world where all nations are supposed to be equal, children of expats should not be sending their children to schooling systems that are different from ours. You came to our country, so you send your children to the same schools that we do. And your children are subjected to the same rules and the same exams that everybody else is. That is what I believe in. But to achieve that, we really need to buck up the government schools first. In order to instill respect and to instill a sense of confidence in Malaysian parents, as well as foreign parents, the first thing we need to do, of course, is to buck up the government schools. And to do that, we really need to get rid of the dead weight who run these schools. Not the regular teachers who are but cogs in a machine, as I've repeatedly said. Do not punch down on the teachers of the government schools. Punch up at the people in charge of these schools. And then, perhaps, once again, we may inspire confidence in our public school system. And once again, we can make Malaysian education great again. So besides buffing up the students' English, as English is the common lingua franca of business and technology, whether we like it or not, we must also inculcate a sense of critical analysis in students. What that means is that critical thinking is very important to create intelligent, informed, and well-rounded students. Too little emphasis in Malaysia is given to critical thinking because the education system from Mahathir onwards basically seems to follow the Prussian education system, which is STEM-oriented. If you watch my previous video on how only humanities can save Malaysia, even art stream students don't get much in the way of art stream subjects. What that means is that, yeah, you can learn things like economics, commerce, and accounting, but those are not fundamentally really humanities subjects, because we never get to learn sociology, or we never get to learn critical thinking, and we never get to learn philosophy. While, on the other hand, literature is something that so few students even take. So the fact of the matter is that there is very little emphasis placed on the arts and humanities and on critical thinking in our system, which is something that we can offer that can actually make government schools a very, very, very alluring thing for parents. Because parents, you see, do not only want their children to go to school to learn skills for their bread and butter, to become cogs in a capitalist machine. No. Believe it or not, parents also want their children to learn critical thinking and living skills and common sense in order to become well-informed citizens that will make good decisions. Yes, critical thinking is extremely important and is something that is extremely neglected in this country because of our contempt for the arts and humanities, because the arts and humanities don't make you a good little capitalist drone, do they? So, yeah, that's something that we really need to back up as well in the government schools. So in conclusion, you know, there are a lot of things to criticize about vernacular schools and private schools and international schools, and eventually we're going to have one cohesive system where all students are put under the same system. Eventually that's going to happen someday. It may not happen in our lifetimes, it may not happen in our children's lifetimes, but eventually we're going to have to reach a point when Malaysians see themselves as Malaysian first and whatever race or culture they are second. Eventually, we're going to have to arrive at a point when we all have a common Malaysian identity that is reflected in our school system. The day has not arrived yet, but we're going to arrive there. And before we arrive at that point, we need to make sure that this identity is not created by force, but by winning the hearts and minds of Malaysian parents. And to do that, we need to start by cleaning out the trash in our government schools. And, you know, basically giving more support to the teachers who work there, rather than punching down on them. A lot of parents have asked me if I will consider re-entering the school system. And my reply is always the same. I really do miss teaching at a school. And I really, really do miss the classroom environment. But under capitalism, I refuse to participate in this reactionary system. Under socialism, under a socialist system that is teacher-centered, that gives the teachers the support they need rather than the demonization by the public, where the students are taught critical thinking and are basically given a quality education regardless of class, I will enter the government school system. When we become a socialist country, and when all students are equal, only then will I re-enter the system and contribute to making Malaysia the great country that we say it is. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.